Chapter 1. A Violent Crime. Billy Ray Cobb sat on the back of the pickup drinking a beer, watching his friend Pete Willard take his turn with the black girl. She was 10 and small for her age. She did not look at the man on top of her. He was breathing hard and swearing. He was hurting her. When he finished, he hit her in the mouth and laughed. And the other man laughed too. Then they laughed harder and rolled around the grass by the pickup, screaming like two crazy men. The girl lay in a pool of blood and beer. Later, Willard asked what Billy Ray planned to do now that they had finished with her. Billy Ray said they should kill her. "Are you going to do it?" asked Willard. Cobb hesitated. "No, I'll let you do it." Willard said, "It wasn't my idea. You're the one who's good at killing niggers. You do it." He thought for a minute while he finished a beer. "Let's throw her off a bridge." "Good idea. Very good idea," said Billy Ray. They drove past Lake Chatulla, a large man-made mud hole in the far southwest corner of Ford County, looking for a place to throw out their unwanted passenger. At each bridge they approached, they saw blacks fishing in the muddy water. Cobb was getting desperate by now. He turned off into a side road and stopped the pickup. They threw her into the long grass at the edge of the woods. Carl Lee Haley did not hurry home when he got the phone call. Gwen was easily excited, and she had called him at work before, when she thought the children had been kidnapped. He only became anxious when he turned into his yard and saw the police car parked next to the house. As he opened the front door, he wondered where Tony and the boys were. Then he heard Gwen crying. To his right, in the small living room, he saw a crowd around a small figure. The child was covered with towels and surrounded by crying relatives. As he went closer, the crying stopped and they moved back. Carl Lee Haley asked what had happened. No one answered. Only Gwen stayed by the girl, holding her hand. He knelt beside the sofa and touched the girl's shoulder. He spoke to his daughter, and she tried to smile. Both her eyes were swollen shut and bleeding. Carl Lee stood and turned to the crowd and demanded to know what had happened. He asked for the third time. The deputy, Willie Hastings, one of Gwen's cousins, stepped forward and told Carl Lee that some people were fishing down by the river when they saw Tanya lying in the middle of the road. She told them her daddy's name, and they brought her home. "What happened, Willie?" Carl Lee shouted as he stared at the deputy. Hastings spoke slowly, looking out of the window while he repeated what Tanya had told her mother about the white men and their pickup and the rope and the trees and being hurt when they got on her. Hastings stopped when he heard the sound of the approaching ambulance. Carl Lee walked out of the house with his daughter in his arms. He whispered gently to her, the tears rolling down his face. He walked to the back of the ambulance and stepped inside. The doctor closed the door and carefully took her from him. Ozzie Walls was the only black sheriff in Mississippi. He was proud of this, especially since Ford County was 74% white and the other black sheriffs had been from much blacker counties. He arrested Billy Ray Cobb and Willard in Huey's, a bar on Highway 365 near the lake outside town. They had been there all evening, drinking whiskey and telling everybody about the good time they had been having. Bad news travels fast, and the story had soon reached the sheriff. Ozzie was smiling when he walked to the table where Cobb was sitting with Willard and two others. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't allow niggers in here," said Cobb, and the four started to laugh. Ozzie continued to smile. When the laughing stopped, Ozzie said, "You boys having a good time, Billy Ray?" "We were." "Looks like it. I hate to interrupt your conversation, but you and Mr. Willard need to come with me." "Where are we going?" Willard asked. "For a ride." "I ain't moving," said Cobb. Willard stared desperately at Cobb. Cobb drank his beer and said, "I ain't going to jail." Ozzie's deputy passed the sheriff the longest, blackest police stick ever used in Ford County. Ozzie struck the center of the table, sending beer and cans in all directions. Willard sat up as if he had been hit. He put his wrists together and held them out for Deputy Looney. He was dragged outside and thrown into a police car. Cobb did not move. Ozzie took him by the hair and lifted him from his chair, then pushed his face into the floor. He put a knee into his back, slid his stick under his throat, and pulled upward while pushing down on the knee. Cobb stopped moving when he couldn't breathe anymore. He was no trouble after that. Ozzie dragged Cobb by the hair across the dance floor, out of the door, across the yard, and threw him into the back seat with Willard. Jake Briggins woke at 5:30 a.m. as usual, rolled out of bed, and went downstairs to make coffee for his wife Carla. She was still asleep. He had to be at the coffee shop at 6 a.m. He had made many rules like this for himself. He was ambitious, but poor. If he was going to be the most successful lawyer in the state, he knew he would also have to be the hardest working. He gave Carla her coffee, kissed his still sleeping 4-year-old daughter goodbye, and went out of the house. The new red Saab he drove had a lot in common with the beautiful 19th century house he had just left. First, they were the only ones of their kind in Ford County. Second, he owed the 3 local banks a lot of money for both of them. There were good reasons why Jake Briggins worked so hard. He heard about the rape of Tanya Haley at the coffee shop as he was eating breakfast with Tim Nunley, who worked at the local garage, and Bill and Bert West, who worked at the shoe factory north of town. There were 3 deputies having breakfast at the next table, and they asked him if he had defended Billy Ray Cobb on a drugs case a few years ago. "No, I didn't represent him. I think he had a Memphis lawyer," Jake replied. "What's he done?" "We arrested him last night for rape." "Rape?" "Yes, him and Pete Willard." "Who did they rape?" "You remember that Haley nigger you looked after in that murder trial a few years ago?" "Lester Haley? Of course I remember." "You know his brother Carl Lee?" "Sure, know him well. I know all the Haleys, represented most of them." "Well, it was his little girl." You're joking. No. Suddenly, Jake didn't feel hungry anymore. He pushed his plate to one side. He listened to the conversation change from fishing to Japanese cars and back to fishing. At 3 minutes before 7, Jake unlocked the front door to his office and turned on the lights. His office was a 2-story building in a row of 2-story buildings overlooking the courthouse on the north side of the square, just down from the coffee shop. The building had been built by the Wilbanks family back in the 1890s, when they owned most of Ford County. There had been a Wilbanks practicing law in the building until 1979, when Jake's employer, Lucien Wilbanks, had been thrown out of the legal profession for a series of offenses resulting from a serious drink problem. Lucien had been more hurt by this than anything that had happened to him in his troubled life. He gave the keys of the office to Jake and left town. The firm was now Jake's, and though Lucien had come back, he had no involvement with it. He spent most of his time up at the Wilbanks place, drinking whiskey and looking out over the garden. Carl Lee had not been able to sleep at the hospital. Tanya's condition was serious, but she was not going to die. They had seen her at midnight, after the doctor warned them that she looked bad. She did. Gwen had kissed the little bandaged face, while Carl Lee stood at the end of the bed, unable to do anything but stare at the small figure surrounded by machines, tubes, and nurses. The sheriff, Ozzie Walls, brought coffee and cakes at 2 in the morning and told Carl Lee all he knew about Cobb and Willard. Jake began to check his mail. He heard his secretary, Ethel Twitty, come in at 8:30, as usual. At around that time, Sheriff Ozzie Walls was typing up Pete Willard's story of the rape. Ozzie had told Willard what had happened to the last white man who had gone to the state jail at Parchman. About 5 years ago, a young white man in Helena County raped a black girl. She was 12. They were waiting for him when he got to Parchman. Knew he was coming. On his first night, about 30 blacks tied him over a big oil drum and climbed on. The guards watched and laughed. They hate rapists. The other prisoners got him every night for 3 months, and then they killed him. After that, Willard seemed to want to help the sheriff as much as he could. Chapter 2. Revenge. Jake was in court the next day to see Billy Ray and Willard go before the local judge and to hear Ozzie Wall's report of Willard's story. Carl Lee was there, too. As soon as they had heard the judge say that the 2 men should be kept in jail, Carl Lee and Jake walked out of the courtroom and down to the first floor. They stopped at the back door of the court. They talked about Tanya and Carl Lee's family. Then Carl Lee told Jake that his younger brother Lester was coming down from Chicago. "What's Lester coming in for?" Jake asked. "Family business." "Are you 2 planning something?" "No, he just wants to see Tanya." "You 2 be careful." "That's easy for you to say, Jake." "I know." "You've got a little girl. If she was lying up in the hospital, beaten and raped, what would you do?" Jake looked through the window of the door and could not answer. Carl Lee waited. Don't do anything stupid, Carl Lee. Answer my question. What would you do? I don't know. I don't know what I'd do. Let me ask you this. If it was your little girl, and if it was two niggers, and you could get your hands on them, what would you do? Kill them? Carl Lee smiled, then laughed. I'm sure you would, Jake. I'm sure you would. Then you'd hire an expensive lawyer to say you were crazy, just like you did when you defended Lester. As they came out of the courthouse, Jake told Carl Lee it had been different when Lester was on trial. There was no planning. The man Lester had killed had attacked him first. Carl Lee looked back up at the stairs. Is this how they'll come into the courtroom? He asked, without looking at Jake. Who? Those boys. Yes. Most of the time they take them up those stairs. It's quicker and safer. They can park right outside the door here. Are you ready to defend another member of my family? Don't do it, Carl Lee. It's not worth it. What if you're found guilty and they give you the electric chair? What about your children? Who'll look after them? I have no choice, Jake. I'll never sleep till those two are dead. I owe it to my little girl. I owe it to myself, and I owe it to my people. It'll be done. They opened the doors and walked down to Washington Street, opposite Jake's office. They shook hands. Jake promised to stop at the hospital the next day to see Gwen and the family. One more thing, Jake. Will you meet me at the jail when they arrest me? Jake nodded before he thought about what Carl Lee was saying. Carl Lee smiled and walked down the sidewalk to his pickup. Carl Lee's younger brother, Lester, drove from Chicago to Clanton in his new Cadillac. It was late Wednesday night when he arrived at the hospital. He found some of his cousins reading magazines in the second-floor waiting room. When he saw Carl Lee, he pulled him close and held him tightly. They had not seen each other since the Christmas holidays, when half the blacks in Chicago traveled home to Mississippi and Alabama. How is she? Lester asked. Better. Much better. Might go home this weekend. Lester felt his breathing get easier. When he had left Chicago 11 hours earlier, he had thought she was near death. He lit a cigarette under the no smoking sign and stared at his big brother. You okay? Carl Lee nodded. He looked down the hall. Come outside, he said. I've got some things to ask you. The Ford County Courthouse opened at 8 a.m. and closed at 5 p.m. every day, except Friday, when it closed at 4:30. At 4:30 on Friday, Carl Lee was hiding in a first-floor toilet. He sat and listened quietly for an hour. No one. Silence. He walked through the wide, dark hall to the back doors and looked through the window. There was no one around. He listened for a while. No one. He started to study the building. He pretended to be on trial. He put his hands behind him and walked the 30 feet to the stairs. Up the stairs, 10 steps, then a turn to the left, just like Lester said. He had a good memory, and Lester's time in the Army had made him good at giving directions. Carl Lee studied the courthouse for over an hour. Up and down, he followed the movements that would be made by the men who had raped his daughter. He followed them in his mind, room by room. He sat in the judge's chair and looked out over the court. He sat in one of the comfortable chairs in the jury box. He sat in the witness chair. It was dark at 7 o'clock when Carl Lee Haley raised a window in the toilet and went quietly through the bushes and into the darkness. Getting the gun was no problem. Carl Lee and Lester just went to Memphis, met an old Army friend of Carl Lee's called Cat Brewster, and asked for an M16. 2 hours later, it was in the trunk of Lester's Cadillac. The gun was the easy part. What came next would be harder. On May 20th, Billy Ray Cobb and Pete Willard were brought back to the court to hear Judge Bullard tell them the date of their trial. Jake Briggins had no reason to be in court, but he still worried about Carl Lee as he worked in his office. Just before 2 o'clock, he went over to the window one more time and lit another cigarette. The two rapists had just heard that they would be held in the county jail until the trial. The crowd started to leave the courtroom, but Carl Lee's brother Lester did not move. He watched closely as the two white boys were taken through the door into the room behind the judge's table. When they were out of sight, he placed his head in his hands and said a short prayer. Then he listened. Cobb went first down the stairs, then Willard, then Deputy Looney. 10 steps down, then turn right, then 10 steps to the first floor. 3 other deputies waited outside by the police cars, smoking and watching the reporters who had come to the court. When Cobb reached the second step from the floor, with Willard 3 steps behind, and Looney 1 step behind him, a small door burst open, and Carl Lee Haley jumped out from the darkness with the M16 in his hands. Holding the gun only 1 or 2 feet from the men who had raped his daughter, he opened fire. The loud, rapid gunfire shook the courthouse and broke the silence. The rapists froze, then screamed as they were hit. Cobb first, in the stomach and chest, then Willard in the face, neck, and throat. They tried to run back up the stairs, but fell over each other as they slipped on their own blood. Deputy Looney was hit in the leg, but managed to get up the stairs into a back room. From there, he could hear the screams of Cobb and Willard, and the crazy nigger laughing. Bullets continued to hit the walls of the narrow stairway, and as he looked through the door, Looney could see blood and flesh sliding down the walls. The enormous explosions of the M16 filled the courthouse. Through the gunfire and the sounds of the bullets hitting the walls of the stairway, Looney could still hear Carl Lee's crazy laughter. When Carl Lee stopped, he threw the gun at the 2 bodies and ran into the toilet. He went out through the window, as he had done on that earlier evening, onto the sidewalk. Then he walked to his pickup and drove home. Cobb, or what was left of him, stopped moving and lay against Willard. Their blood mixed and ran down each step, covering the foot of the stairway. Jake ran across the street to the back door of the courthouse. 1 deputy was on the floor, a gun in his hand, shouting at the reporters who were trying to get in. The other deputies looked out from behind the police cars. Jake ran to the front of the courthouse, where more deputies were guarding the door and getting people out of the building. Jake pushed his way through the crowd and inside. There, he found Ozzie Walls directing people and shouting instructions to his men. He called to Jake, and they walked down the hall to the back of the court, where a half-dozen deputies stood, guns in hand, looking silently at the stairway. Jake felt sick. The front of Willard's head was missing. Cobb had taken most of the bullets in his back. The thick smell of gunfire hung over the stairway. "Jake, you better leave," Ozzie said, without taking his eyes off the bodies. "Why?" "Just leave." "Why?" "Because we've got to take pictures and stuff, and you don't need to be here." "Okay. But you don't question him without me there. Understand?" Ozzie nodded. The only vehicles outside the Haley house were Gwen's car, Carl Lee's pickup, and the red Cadillac from Illinois. Ozzie expected no trouble as the police cars parked in a row across the front yard. The deputies bent down behind the open doors, watching as the sheriff walked alone to the house. He stopped. The front door opened slowly, and the Haley family came out. The two groups watched each other, each waiting for the other to say or do something, each wanting to avoid what had to happen. Ozzie kicked at some dirt on the path, looking at the family, then at his men. Finally, he said, "You'd better come with me." Carl Lee looked at the sheriff, but did not move. Gwen and the boy cried as Lester took the girl from her daddy. Then Carl Lee knelt in front of the three boys and whispered to them again that he must leave, but he wouldn't be gone long. He held them close, and they all cried and held on to him. He turned and kissed his wife, then walked down the steps to the sheriff. Chapter 3. Afterward. "You can see him in a minute, Jake," Ozzie said after Carl Lee had been brought back to the sheriff's office. "Thanks. You sure he did it?" "Yes, I'm sure." "He didn't say he did it." "No, he didn't say anything. I guess Lester told him what to do." Half an hour later, lawyer and client sat across the table and looked at each other carefully. They smiled, but neither spoke. They had last talked 5 days before, the day after the rape. Carl Lee was not as troubled now. His face was relaxed and his eyes were clear. Finally, he said, "You didn't think I'd do it, Jake." "Not really. You did do it." "You know I did." Jake smiled, nodded, and crossed his arms. "How do you feel?" Carl Lee sat back in the folding chair. "Well, I feel better. I don't feel good about the whole thing. But then, I don't feel good about what happened to my girl, you know." "Are you scared?" "Of what?" "How about the electric chair?" "No, Jake. That's why I've got you. I don't plan to go to the chair. You helped Lester. Now you can do it for me, Jake." "It's not quite that easy, Carl Lee. You just don't shoot a person, or two people, tell the jury they needed to be killed, and expect to walk out of the courtroom." "You did with Lester." "But every case is different. And the big difference here is that you killed 2 white boys and Lester killed a nigger. Big difference." "You scared, Jake?" Why should I be scared? I'm not facing the electric chair. You don't sound too confident. You big, stupid fool, thought Jake. How could he be confident at a time like this? Sure, he was confident before the killings, but now it was different. His client was facing the electric chair for a crime which everyone knew he did. And that was only the beginning of his problems. Carl Lee was a black who had killed 2 whites in a mainly white county. Rufus Buckley would be the prosecutor, and Rufus would do everything he could to win. It was personal between him and Jake. And there was going to be a problem about money. Jake hated to discuss professional costs, but he knew he had to do it immediately. Clients wanted to know about his charges, and most were shocked at how expensive the law could be. After he had talked about Carl Lee's family and how they were, Jake started to talk about preparing for the trial. Carl Lee made it easy for him and asked how much all of that was going to cost. Jake looked at the file and the contract he had brought with him and thought desperately of a fair amount. There were other lawyers out there who would take such a case for almost nothing. Nothing except publicity. He thought about the land Carl Lee owned, the job at the paper factory, and his family, and finally said, $10,000. Carl Lee did not seem too worried, though he said, "You charged less than $5,000. They finally agreed on $7,500. After Jake filled out the contract and Carl Lee signed, Carl Lee asked, "Jake, how much would you charge a man with plenty of money?" $50,000. $50,000? Are you serious? Yes. Man, that's a lot of money. Did you ever get that much? No, but I haven't seen too many people on trial for murder with that kind of money. Once he had finished talking with his client, Jake left the sheriff's office and walked toward the reporters with their microphones and cameras. Although he pretended he wanted to get away from them, he stopped for enough time to stand in front of the cameras and answer 10 or more questions. Ozzie and the deputies watched from inside. Jake loves cameras, the sheriff said. All lawyers do, added one of the deputies. After a cold supper, Jake and his wife sat at the front of their house and looked out at the garden. They talked about the case. Jake's interview was too late for the early evening news, so he and Carla waited for the 10 o'clock program. And there he was, looking fit and handsome. Jake thought he looked great on TV, and he was excited to be there. He felt good. He enjoyed the publicity. And when Carl Lee Haley was found not guilty of the murder of the 2 white men who raped his daughter before an all-white jury in rural Mississippi... "What are you smiling about?" asked Carla. "Nothing." "Sure. You're thinking about the trial, and the cameras, and the reporters, and walking out of the courthouse with Carl Lee a free man, reporters chasing you with the TV cameras, everyone congratulating you. I know exactly what you're thinking about." "Then why did you ask?" "To see if you'd admit it." "Okay, I admit it. This case could make me famous, and make us $1 million. If you win." Next morning, Tuesday, Jake ate his usual breakfast at the coffee shop. He noticed that some of the regular customers were quieter with him than normal, but he hoped this would change when Deputy Looney was out of hospital. Looney was well liked by the other customers, and Jake knew that there were some who would not be happy about him defending Carl Lee. He spent the rest of the morning making arrangements for the trial and talking to a TV reporter from Memphis. He went home feeling a lot happier. On Wednesday, at 10 a.m., the two rapists were buried. The minister struggled desperately for something comforting to say to the small crowd. The service was short and with few tears. Afterward, friends came to the Cobbs' house. The men sat around in the backyard while the women looked after Mrs. Cobb. The men drank whiskey and talked about the good times when niggers knew their place. Then one cousin said he knew someone who used to be active in the Ku Klux Klan, and he might give him a call. Cobb's grandfather had been in the Klan, the cousin explained, and when he and Billy Ray were children, the old man told stories about hanging niggers in Ford and Tyler counties. They should do the same thing the nigger had done. Maybe the Klan would be interested. In the courtroom, the groups of blacks and whites sat opposite each other and watched the machinery of justice at work. Ozzie Walls was the first witness. He gave a clear report of what had happened when Cobb and Willard were killed and what had happened after. He talked about the shooting, the bodies, the wounds, the gun, the fingerprints on the gun, and the fingerprints of the defendant. Other witnesses followed and told how they had seen Carl Lee shoot the two men and walk out of the courthouse. It was clear that he had killed the men who raped his daughter, and Jake did not ask any questions. Carl Lee was handed to the sheriff to be held until the trial, and everyone left the courtroom. Jake got ready to talk to the reporters who had already started to crowd around the courtroom doors. Later on Wednesday night, the doctors had to remove Looney's leg below the knee. They called Ozzie at the jail, and he told Carl Lee. Rufus Buckley looked through the Thursday morning papers and read with great interest the report of the previous day's events in Ford County. He was delighted to see his name mentioned by the reporters and by Mr. Briggins. He didn't like Briggins, but he was glad Jake used his name in front of the cameras and reporters. For 2 days, Briggins and Carl Lee had had all the publicity. It was time the prosecutor was mentioned. Rufus Buckley was 41 and very ambitious. He wanted a big public position, maybe even governor. He had it all planned, but he was not well known outside the district. He needed to be seen and heard. He needed publicity. Rufus needed, more than anything else, to win a big, nasty, well-publicized murder trial. On the same Thursday morning, Jake was reading the same newspaper. He was interrupted by his secretary, Ethel, who came and stood in front of the big desk.
Mr. Briggins, my husband and I received a threatening phone call last night, and I've just had the second one here at the office. I don't like this.
Jake pointed to a chair. Sit down, Ethel. What did these people say?
They threatened me because I worked for you. Said I'd be sorry because I worked for a nigger lover. They threatened to harm you and your family, too. I'm just scared.
Jake was worried, too, but did not show it to Ethel. He had called Ozzie on Wednesday and reported the calls to his own house. He advised her to change her number. but she did not want to do that. She wanted him to stop defending Carl Lee. Jake refused, and the conversation ended. Like so many conversations he had with Ethel, in disagreement. An hour later, Ethel called him to say that Lucien, the man who had given Jake the law business, had asked Jake to come to his house with some recent cases. Lucien came to the office or called once a month. He read cases and kept up to date with developments in the law. He had little else to do except drink his whiskey. He looked forward to Jake's monthly visits, when he could hear about the world he used to work in and give advice to the only man who now listened to him. The advice was, in fact, surprisingly good, and Jake could never understand how Lucien knew so much. Later on Thursday, therefore, Jake parked the Saab behind Lucien's old Porsche, walked up to the house, and handed the cases to him. Lucien offered whiskey, then wine, then beer, but Jake did not accept any. Carla did not like drinking, and Lucien knew it.
"Congratulations."
For what? Jake asked.
"For the Haley case."
Why are you congratulating me?
"I never had such a big case, and I had some big ones."
What do you mean by big?
"Lots of publicity. That's what makes a lawyer successful, Jake. If you're unknown, you don't eat. When people get in trouble, they call a lawyer. And they call someone they've heard of. You must sell yourself to the public, and you've got to try to get the trial moved to another county. Without enough blacks on the jury, you won't have a chance. This county is 26% black. Every other county in the district is at least 30% black. Van Buren County is 40%. That means more black jurors. If the trial is here, there's a risk of an all-white jury, and believe me, I've seen enough all-white juries in this county. At the very least, you need one black."
Jake felt that it was not going to be easy to get Judge Noose to move the trial, and said so to Lucien.
"That's not a problem," he replied. "The main thing is to ask. Then, when they find that poor man guilty, you can claim he did not have a fair trial because the judge refused to move."
So you don't feel too optimistic about Carl Lee's chances? Lucien thought for a moment.
"Not really. It will be difficult."
Why?
"Looks like it was planned, right?"
Yes.
"I'm sure you'll say he was insane."
I don't know.
"You must," said Lucien. "There is no other possible defense. You can't say it was an accident. You can't say he shot those two boys with a machine gun in self-defense, can you?"
No.
"You won't tell the jury he was at home with his family?"
Of course not.
"Then what other defense do you have? You must say he was crazy."
But Lucien, he was not insane. And there's no way I can find a psychiatrist who will say he was. He planned it. Every detail.
Lucien smiled and took a drink.
"That's why you're in trouble, my boy. But you're still lucky to have the case."
You really think so?
Asked Jake.
"I'm serious. It's a lawyer's dream. Win it and you're famous. It could make you rich.
I'll need your help.
You've got it. I need something to do.
The next day, Friday, Lester came into Jake's office and told him the family could only raise $900 to pay for Carl Lee's defense. All of the banks in town had refused to lend money. Wonderful, thought Jake. My family and my secretary are getting threatening phone calls. My best friend tells me I can't win the case. And now I'm only going to get $900 for a case which is going to stop me doing any other work for weeks. Wonderful. Chapter 4. The Klan. Before Carl Lee Haley could go on trial, he had to go in front of a jury of citizens of Ford County. It was their job to decide if the two murders had happened and if it was reasonable for Carl Lee to stand trial. This was the first opportunity for Rufus Buckley to get some of the publicity he wanted so much. The grand jury made its decision. There was a case against Carl Lee, and he would have to stand trial for murder. It was then Rufus Buckley's turn to stand on the front steps of the courthouse in the middle of a crowd of reporters and cameramen. Buckley had copies of the legal documents with Carl Lee's name on. He waved these in front of the cameras. He talked like a priest in church, saying how terrible it was for people to take the law into their own hands. He praised the jury for the decision they had made. He accused Carl Lee Haley of being a lawless man and said he wanted the trial to happen soon. He guaranteed he would prove that Carl Lee Haley was guilty of murder. He guaranteed Carl Lee Haley would die on the electric chair. He was rude, unpleasant, self-important. He was himself. A few of the reporters left, but he did not stop talking. He told those who remained about his skill as a lawyer and his success as a prosecutor. More reporters left. More cameras were turned off. He praised Judge Noose for his wisdom and fairness. He praised the intelligence and good judgment of Ford County jurors. When he finished speaking, there were no reporters left. They had grown tired of him. Stump Sisson was the Ku Klux Klan's leader in Mississippi. He had called the meeting at a small hut deep in the forest in Nettles County, 230 miles south of Ford County. There were no special clothes or speeches. The small group of Klansmen discussed the events in Ford County with Freddie Cobb, brother of Billy Ray. Freddie had called a friend who had contacted Stump to arrange the meeting.
When's the nigger's trial?
I'm not sure, Cobb said. I think it'll probably be later in summer.
He was most worried, he said, by all the talk about the nigger saying he was insane and going free. It wasn't right. The nigger killed his brother in cold blood, planned the shooting. What could the Klan do about it? Cobb complained that the niggers had so much protection these days that no one could do anything against them.
Hell, white people ain't got a chance except for the Klan. Who else will march and stand up for white people? All the laws work to help the niggers. That's why we called the Klan.
What about your brother? Did he rape her?
We're not sure. Probably not. Willard, the other one, said he did it.
But Billy Ray never did. He always had plenty of women. Why would he rape a little nigger girl? And if he did, what's the big problem? Who's the nigger's lawyer? Briggins, a local boy in Clanton. Young, but pretty good. He told some reporters the nigger would say he was insane and would go free. Who's the judge? I don't know yet.
Sisson and the Klan members listened carefully to this mindless farmer. They liked his complaints about the government, but they had also read the papers and watched TV, and they knew his brother had received justice. But at the hands of a nigger, it was unthinkable. The case could be useful to them. With the trial several months away, there was time to plan. They could march during the day around the courthouse in their Klan uniform of tall hats and masks. The press would love it. Hate them, but love the arguments, the anger. And at night, they could frighten people with their burning crosses and threatening phone calls. There would also be violence. They knew what the sight of the Klan did to crowds of angry niggers. Ford County could be their playground for search and destroy, hit and run. They had time to organize and call in people from other states. The Haley case could be used to bring together all the Southern whites who still refused to accept the rights of blacks to a place in society. Mr. Cobb, can you get us the names and addresses of the nigger, his family, his lawyer, the judge, and the jurors? Asked Sisson. Cobb thought about this. Everybody except the jurors. They ain't been chosen yet. What are you thinking? We're not sure, but the Klan will most likely get involved. We need to remind people we're still here, and this could be a good opportunity. Can I help? Cobb asked. Sure, but you'd need to be a member. We ain't got any Klan up in Clanton. It stopped meeting a long time ago. My grandfather used to be a member. You mean the grandfather of this man was a Klansman? Yes, Cobb answered proudly. Well, then we must get involved. Buckley's 4 o'clock press conference did not come on the early evening news. Jake laughed when first the national TV channels, and then Memphis, then Jackson, then Ripolo, ended their broadcasts with no news about the Haley trial and no pictures of Buckley on the screen. At 10, Jake and his wife Carla lay in the dark on the sofa, waiting for the news. Finally, there was Buckley, on the front steps, waving papers and shouting, while the reporter explained that this was Rufus Buckley, the man who would prosecute Carl Lee Haley. The camera was pointed at Buckley for a few seconds, and then the camera moved around the town square to give a wonderful view of the center of Clanton. It finally came back to the reporter for 2 sentences about a trial in late summer.
Buckley's really horrible,
Carla said, and turned off the sound of the TV.
You know what I dislike most about your murder trials?
She kicked the cushions off the sofa with her thin, brown, almost perfect legs. The blood? The pain?
No.
She let her shoulder-length hair fall around her as she fell back on the sofa. The loss of life?
No.
She was wearing one of his old shirts. She began to play with the buttons. The horrible possibility of an innocent man facing the electric chair?
No.
She unbuttoned the shirt. The blue television screen was the only light in the room. It was enough for Jake to see her almost perfect arms reach out for him. The emotion? The desire?
That's more like it,
she said, and slid an almost perfect brown leg up to the back of the sofa, where it gently came to rest. They moved closer to each other, and she turned off the TV. The room was warm and dark. Chapter 5. Lawyers. Harry Rex Vonner was enormously fat. He was a lawyer who specialized in cases where marriages had broken down nastily. He could be just as nasty as his cases, and his services were in great demand. He could get you the children, the house, the farm, the dog, everything. One wealthy farmer sent him a check each month so that the woman he was married to, his fourth wife, couldn't hire him for herself. Harry Rex sent his criminal cases to Jake, and Jake sent his nasty marriage problem cases to Harry Rex. They were friends, and they disliked other lawyers, especially Rufus Buckley. On Tuesday morning, Harry Rex came slowly up the stairs to Jake's office. The stairway shook as he climbed to the first floor. He was breathing heavily as he entered the big room. "Morning, Harry Rex."
"Why don't you get a downstairs office?"
he demanded between breaths. "You need the exercise. If it weren't for those stairs, your weight would be over 300 pounds.
"Thanks. I just came from the courtroom. Noose wants you there at 10:30 if possible. Wants to talk about Haley with you and Buckley. Agree the trial date. He asked me to tell you."
"Good. I'll be there."
"You'll find Buckley there, too. You should see him. He's telling everyone about his big TV appearance last night. But no one wants to talk about it. He's like a child begging for attention."
"Be nice to him. He may be your next governor."
"Not if he loses the Haley case. And he's going to lose Haley, Jake. We'll pick a good jury, 12 good and faithful citizens. Then we'll buy them."
"I didn't hear that."
"It works every time."
A few minutes after 10:30, Jake entered the judge's office behind the courtroom and coolly shook hands with Buckley and the other lawyers. They had been waiting for him. Noose waved him toward a seat and sat behind the desk.
"Jake, this will take just a few minutes. I would like to see Carl Lee Haley in the morning at 9. Any problems with that?"
"No, that'll be fine," replied Jake.
"Okay, now let's discuss a trial date for Mr. Haley. As you know, the next term for the court here is in late August, and I'm sure we'll be just as busy then. Because of the nature of this case, and honestly, because of the publicity, I think it would be best if we had a trial as soon as is practical." "The sooner the better," said Buckley. "Jake, how long will you need to prepare for trial?"
60 days.
60 days? Buckley repeated. "Why so long?"
Jake ignored him. He explained to the judge that they would be using an insanity defense and would need Carl Lee to be examined by a psychiatrist, and that all this would take time. Buckley kept shouting that it was unnecessary.
"Relax, Rufus," Jake said calmly. "The cameras will be here in 60 days, even 90 days.
They won't forget about you. You can give interviews, hold press conferences, everything. Don't worry so much. You'll get your chance." Buckley's face went red. He took 3 steps in Jake's direction. "Gentlemen, please," Noose interrupted. "This is going to be a long, emotional case. I expect you to act like professionals. Now, my diary is very full. The only time I have is the week of July 22nd. Is that a problem?" Jake smiled at Buckley and looked at his own diary. "Looks good to me." After lunch, Jake visited his famous client in Ozzy's office at the jail. He told him the trial was going to start on July 22nd.
"That's 2 months away. Why so long?"
"We need the time. It'll take that long to find a psychiatrist who'll say you were crazy. Then Buckley will send you to Whitfield to be seen by the state psychiatrists, and they'll all say you weren't crazy. It takes time."
"No way to have it sooner?"
"We don't want it sooner."
"And if I do?"
Jake studied him carefully. "What's the matter, big man?"
"I've got to get out of here, and fast."
"I thought you said jail wasn't so bad."
"It ain't, but I need to get home. Gwen's got no money. She can't find a job. Lester's in trouble with his wife, and I hate to ask my family for help."
"But they will help, won't they?"
"A little. They've got their own problems. You've got to get me out of here, Jake."
Gwen, he said, had less than $100. She had to pay bills, and they didn't have much food. She had visited on Sunday and cried for an hour. Her family could not help much. Maybe some vegetables from the garden and a few dollars for milk and eggs. Jake looked through his notes and waited for Carl Lee to ask for some of his money back. Most of his poorer clients did. But the question did not come. "Anything you want to ask, Carl Lee?"
"Yes. What can I say tomorrow when I see the judge?"
"Carl Lee, for the moment, you don't say anything. Remember, you paid me to do the talking." On the Sunday morning, others were thinking about Carl Lee Haley and his family. At black churches all over Clanton, the buckets and baskets and plates were passed and repassed and left at the front doors to collect money for the Haley family. The people who had come to pray were asked to give generously to support Carl Lee and his family. The Reverend Ollie Agee had organized the collection in his church and other churches across town. He was very pleased that the black people of Clanton were giving so much. Another 2 Sundays like this, and the churches would be able to start a strong movement against the nigger haters of Ford County. There might even be enough money to pay for a new Cadillac for some valuable church workers, like the Reverend Ollie Agee. Carl Lee Haley gave the blacks really good reasons to work together. Jake soon discovered that Carl Lee was not the only one with problems. The Ku Klux Klan had decided that it was time to show him their feelings about nigger-loving lawyers. Several hours before the sun rose on Monday morning, 3 Klan members put up a wooden cross in the front yard of Jake's house on Adams Street and set fire to it. It was a warning. "This scares you, doesn't it?" Jake asked his wife as they stared out in horror at the burning cross.
"If they can do this, Jake,"
Carla replied slowly,
"why not the house? No case is worth this. You've got to stop.
Chapter 6. Professional Witnesses. Jake had no intention of dropping the case. First, he had to find a psychiatrist they could afford. He needed to talk to Lucien. 2 days after Jake phoned him, Lucien called Ethel. He asked her to tell Jake to come see him. It was important. He had a visitor that Jake needed to meet. Dr. W.T. Bass was a retired psychiatrist from Jackson. His retirement had been for the same reasons that Lucien was forbidden to practice law. He had a liking for whiskey that was stronger than his liking for his profession. The doctor and Lucien sat outside the house, waiting for Jake to arrive.
"What do you want me to do?"
asked Dr. Bass.
"Just say he was insane."
"Was he?" asked the doctor.
"That's not important. What is important? To give the jury a reason to say Carl Lee was not guilty. They won't care if he's crazy or not, but they'll need some reason to let him go. It would be nice to examine him. You can. He's at the jail, just waiting for someone to talk to. I'll need to meet with him several times." "I know that." "And if I don't think he was insane at the time of the shooting?" "Then you won't be able to speak at the trial and get your name and picture in the paper, and you won't be interviewed on TV.
Bass finished one glass and poured another. He was not happy about taking the case. He didn't practice now, and he was frightened of making a fool of himself. He knew his weaknesses.
"What about this?"
He waved his drink at Lucien.
"You shouldn't drink so much,"
Lucien replied, keeping the smile off his face with difficulty. The doctor dropped his drink and exploded in laughter. He rolled out of his chair, holding his stomach, helpless with laughter.
"And now you're drunk,"
Lucien said, as he went into the house for another bottle. When Jake arrived an hour later, Lucien and the doctor were asleep. Jake walked up the steps to the house and woke Lucien.
"Jake, my boy, how are you?"
"Fine, Lucien. I see you're doing quite well." He looked at the empty bottle, and one not quite empty.
"I wanted you to meet a man,"
Lucien said, trying to sit up straight. "Who is he?"
"A psychiatrist, Dr. Bass from Jackson. A good friend. He'll help us with Haley."
"Is he a good psychiatrist?"
"The best. We've worked together on several insanity cases. He drinks like a fish, but never during a trial."
"That's comforting."
"He wants to meet Haley as soon as possible. Tomorrow, if he can."
The one problem today was that no one could wake Dr. Bass to arrange the meeting. Jake walked down the steps toward his car, listening to his former boss laugh and curse and throw pieces of ice at Dr. W.T. Bass, psychiatrist, witness for the defense. Deputy Dwayne Looney left the hospital that afternoon and drove his wife and 3 children to the jail, where the sheriff, the other deputies, and a few friends waited with a cake and small gifts. He would continue to work in the office and would keep his uniform and full salary. 2 days later, Carl Lee Haley was taken to meet Dr. Wilbert Roadheaver, the head psychiatrist at the state hospital. Dr. Roadheaver had been appointed by the prosecutor to see if Carl Lee had been insane or not when he killed the men who raped his daughter and accidentally shot Deputy Looney. Chapter 7. Problems for Jake. Several legal steps were still needed before Carl Lee's trial. First, Jake had to ask for the trial to be moved to another part of the state. Although he did not win this argument, he felt okay. He did a good job in court and looked a lot better than Rufus Buckley, the prosecutor. The problem was that the judge then decided that there was too much publicity about the case and told both lawyers they had to stop talking to journalists. He did not want the trial to be held in the newspapers and on TV. Outside the courthouse, it hurt to say no to the reporters. They followed Jake across Washington Street, where he excused himself with a "no comment" and escaped into his office. The loss of publicity hurt even more when Ethel came in to tell him the firm had big money problems. Since the start of the Haley case, he had seen no other clients and had not been chasing those who had failed to pay him.
"Look at these,"
she said, waving a handful of bills under his nose.
$4,000. How am I supposed to pay these?
How much is in the bank?
$1,900. Nothing came in this morning.
Nothing.
Not a penny.
After Ethel had complained for another 5 minutes about how this case was ruining the business, Jake lost his temper.
"Shut up, Ethel. Just shut up. If you can't take the pressure, then leave. If you can't keep your mouth shut, then you're fired." "You'd like to fire me, wouldn't you?" "Maybe I would. I don't care at the moment."
She was a strong, hard woman. 14 years with Lucien had done that to her. But at the moment, she was clearly very unhappy.
"I'm sorry,"
she said.
"I'm just worried."
Worried about what?
"Me and Bud."
What's wrong with Bud?
"He's a very sick man."
I know that.
"His blood pressure is getting worse, especially after the phone calls. He's scared. We're both scared."
How many phone calls?
"Several. They threaten to burn our house or blow it up. They always tell us they know where we live, and if Haley goes free, then they'll burn it down while we're asleep."
Jake found it difficult to be sympathetic to Ethel. There were other things on his mind. His wife wanted him to drop this case. He knew that the bank would not lend him any more money. The Ku Klux Klan were threatening both him and his secretary. And now he could not talk to the newspapers and get the publicity he needed so badly. The Ford County Ku Klux Klan had its first meeting at midnight on Thursday, July 11th, in a field in a forest somewhere in the northern part of the county. The 6 new members stood nervously in front of the enormous burning cross and repeated strange words after the leader. An armed guard stood quietly down the road, sometimes looking at the ceremony, but mainly watching for uninvited guests. There were none. At exactly midnight, the 6 fell to their knees and closed their eyes as white cloths were placed over their heads. They were Klansmen now, these 6, and among them was Freddie Cobb, brother of the dead rapist. A few hours later, Pirtle, the deputy on night duty at the sheriff's office, received a phone call. The caller did not give a name, but he said that the Klan was planning to blow up Jake Briggance's house that night. Pirtle woke the sheriff, and within 10 minutes of the call, Ozzie Walls and 2 deputies were outside Jake's house. They checked that there was no one around, then Ozzie pressed the doorbell. The wooden door opened, and Jake looked out at the sheriff. He was wearing a nightshirt that fell just below his knees, and he held a loaded gun in his right hand. "What is it, Ozzie?" he asked.
"Can I come in?"
"Yes. What's going on?"
"Stay outside and wait for me,"
Ozzie told the deputies. Ozzie closed the front door behind them and turned off the light. They sat in the dark living room overlooking the front yard. Ozzie told Jake what the Klan were planning to do, and told him to get his wife and daughter out of town as soon as he could. Jake had never moved so fast in his life. Within 15 minutes, Carla and their daughter were in the car and driving to a neighbor's house. Ozzie, Jake, and the deputies sat outside in the dark, waiting for the Klan to come. They didn't have to wait long. Ozzie saw him first, a man walking down the street. In his hand, he carried a box, a suitcase of some sort. Ozzie took out his handgun and stick and watched the man walk directly toward him. Suddenly, the figure ran across the yard next door and to the side of Jake's house. He carefully laid the small suitcase under Jake's bedroom window. As he turned to run, Ozzie's police stick crashed across the side of his head, tearing his right ear into 2 pieces. He screamed and fell to the ground.
"What's your name?"
Ozzie demanded. The man said nothing.
"I asked you a question,"
Ozzie said. Pirtle and Nesbit stood beside him, guns ready, too frightened to speak or move.
"I ain't speaking,"
came the reply. Ozzie raised the stick high over his head and brought it down on the man's right ankle. They could all hear the bone crack. He screamed, and Ozzie kicked him in the face. He fell backward, and his head hit the side of the house. Jake looked at the suitcase and then put his ear next to it. He jumped back.
"It's ticking,"
he said weakly. Ozzie bent over the man and laid the police stick softly against his nose.
"I've got one more question before I break every bone in your body. What's in the case?"
No answer. Ozzie pulled back the stick and broke the man's other ankle.
"What's in the case?"
he shouted.
"Dynamite,"
came the reply. Ozzie tied the man to a gas pipe next to the window. He carefully lifted the suitcase by the handle and placed it neatly between the man's broken legs. Ozzie kicked both legs to spread them. Ozzie, the deputies, and Jake backed away slowly and watched him. The man began to cry.
"I don't know how to stop it,"
he said.
"You'd better learn fast,"
Jake said.
"Give me some light, and I need both hands,"
he said.
"Try it with one,"
Ozzie said. They waited on the other side of the street, saying little, listening for any unusual noise. After about 15 minutes, the man shouted, and they ran back across the front yard. The empty suitcase had been thrown a few feet away. Next to the man was a neat pile of 12 sticks of dynamite. Between his legs was a large, round-faced clock with wires connected to it. Ozzy bent down and removed the clock and the wires. He did not touch the dynamite.
Where are your friends?
No answer. He took out his stick again and moved closer to the man.
I'm gonna start breaking bones one at a time. You'd better start talking. Now, where are your friends?
No answer. Ozzy stood and quickly looked around. Not at Jake and the deputies, but at the house next door. Seeing nothing, he raised the stick. The man's left arm was still tied to the gas pipe, and Ozzy hit him just above the elbow. The man screamed and pulled to the left. Jake almost felt sorry for him.
Where are they?
Ozzy demanded. No answer. Jake turned his head as the sheriff hit the man again.
Where are they?
No answer. Ozzy raised the stick.
Stop! Please, stop!
The man shouted.
Where are they?
Down that way. About 2 streets.
Get the cars,
Ozzy ordered. 2 hours later, Jake was in the sheriff's office. His wife and daughter were already on a plane to the town where Carla's parents lived, 500 miles away. Carla had returned to the house to pack, but had not spoken a word to him. There was no doubt that she blamed him for the danger they had all been in. Jake was happy that his family was alive, but still shook when he thought about what nearly happened. He smiled at Ozzy. You play rough, don't you?
Only when I have to. I didn't hear you object.
No, I wanted to help. What about his friend?
We found him sleeping in a red pickup about a half a mile from your house.
Where is he?
Hospital. Same room as the other.
My God, Ozzy, did you break his legs too?
Jake, my friend, he did not cooperate with the police. We had to encourage him.
Chapter 8. The Research Assistant. After talking with Ozzy Walls, Jake went to Lucien's house. He was lonely and unhappy. He had financial problems. His wife and child had gone. He had not slept for 24 hours. When Lucien offered him a beer, he drank it quickly and accepted another and then another. By the end of the afternoon, he was drunk. By the end of the evening, he was unconscious. The next day, he woke with the worst headache he had ever had in his life. He was not a man who drank a lot. In fact, the last time he had felt like this was when he was a law student. The way he felt now reminded him of the many reasons why he did not like to drink. Later in the morning, Jake was sitting at his desk, looking out at the courthouse. He still had a bad headache and could not work. Now he had to start to prepare for the most important case of his life, with no money in the bank, a drunk law partner, a drunk psychiatrist, and this headache. He was still sitting there when he heard someone knocking at the door downstairs. He ignored it for 15 minutes, but whoever it was knew that he was there. He walked to the window and looked out. "Who is it?" he shouted at the street. A woman stepped back from the sidewalk under the window and leaned on a black BMW parked next to the Saab. Her hands were deep in the pockets of old, well-fitting jeans. The midday sun lit up her gold-red hair.
Are you Jake Briggins?
She asked. Yes? What do you want?
I need to talk to you.
I'm very busy.
It's very important. I just need 5 minutes of your time.
Jake unlocked the door. She walked in and shook his hand.
I'm Ellen Rourke.
He pointed to a seat by the door. Nice to meet you. Sit down. Jake sat on the edge of Ethel's desk. One sound or two?
I beg your pardon?
She had a quick northeastern accent, but you could also hear she had spent some time in the South. Is it Rourke or Roark?
R-O-A-R-K. That's Rourke in Boston and Roark in Mississippi.
Mind if I call you Ellen?
Please do. And can I call you Jake?
Yes, please.
Good. I hadn't planned to call you Mr. Briggins.
So you come from Boston?
Yes, I was born there. Went to Boston College. My dad is Sheldon Rourke, a well-known criminal lawyer in Boston.
I guess I've missed him. What brings you to Mississippi?
I'm in law school.
Well, now that we know each other, what brings you to Clanton?
Carl Lee Haley.
I'm not surprised.
I'll finish law school in December. I'm killing time in Oxford this summer, and I'm bored.
Jake smiled and studied her carefully. What makes you think I need help?
I know you practice alone, and I know you don't have a law clerk.
What qualifications do you bring with you?
I come from a very intelligent family. Last summer, I spent 3 months with the Southern Prisoners' Defense Movement in Birmingham and helped with 7 murder trials. In my spare time, I write reports for organizations that give free legal advice. I was brought up in my father's law office, and I was a good legal researcher before I could drive. I'm 25 years old, and when I grow up, I want to be a great criminal lawyer like my dad. Also, my father is very rich, and I've got more money than you, so I'll work without charge. A free law clerk for 3 weeks. I'll do all the research, typing, answering the phone. I'll even carry your papers and make the coffee.
I was afraid you'd want to be a partner in my firm.
No, I'm a woman, and I'm in the South. I know my place.
Why are you so interested in this case?
I want to be in the courtroom. I love criminal trials. Big trials where it's a question of life or death. It's a trial lawyer's dream. I just want to be there. I'll stay out of the way, I promise. Just let me work with you and watch the trial.
Judge News hates women lawyers.
So does every male lawyer in the South. Besides, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a law student.
I'll let you explain that to him.
So I've got the job?
Yes, you've got the job. I could use some free research. These cases are complicated. She gave a beautiful, confident smile.
When do I start?
After he had shown her around the office, it was time for lunch, so Jake took Ellen Rourke with him to the coffee shop. As they ate, he looked across at her. Her face was gentle and pleasant with an easy smile. She was not beautiful, but she was intelligent and amazingly attractive. For the first time in 2 days, Jake began to think he might live. They talked about his plans for the defense. Jake asked her how she would do it.
Well, from what I hear, our client carefully planned the killings and shot them in cold blood 6 days after the rape. It sounds exactly like he knew what he was doing. Insanity is our only defense, and it sounds impossible to prove.
Are you familiar with the insanity defense? Jake asked.
Yes. Do we have a psychiatrist?
We do and we don't. He'll say anything we want him to say. That is, if he's not drunk at the trial. One of your more difficult jobs will be to make sure that he isn't. It won't be easy, believe me.
I love new experiences in the courtroom.
All right, Roark. Take a pen. Your boss is now going to give you instructions. She began making notes on the paper tablecloth. Chapter 9. Preparations. In early July, Judge Noose instructed Jean, the court clerk, to contact 150 voters as possible jury members. The defense had asked for a large number from which to select the 12, and Noose agreed. Jean and 2 deputy clerks spent Saturday studying the list of voters, selecting possible people. Noose also told Jean that she must not give the list to anyone, not even her old friend Jake Briggins. This trial was too important to give the Klan a chance to start frightening possible jurors, or to let the lawyers start choosing the jurors before the day of jury selection. However, Judge Noose did not know about Harry Rex Vonner's ability to get hold of information. At 10 o'clock the next day, Harry Rex pushed open the door of Jake's office and threw a copy of the jury list onto his desk.
"Don't ask,"
he said. Beside each name, he had made notes. Don't know, hates niggers, or works at the shoe factory probably against Carl Lee. Jake read each name slowly, trying to remember faces or the kind of person they were. There were only names, no addresses, ages, jobs. Most of the names sounded white.
"What do you think?"
asked Harry Rex. Hard to tell. Mostly white, but we expected that. Where did you get this?
"I already said, don't ask. I know 26 names. That's the best I can do."
Your true friend, Harry Rex.
I'm a prince. Are you ready for the trial?
Not yet, but I've found a secret weapon.
What?
You'll meet her later. As they finished their conversation, Ellen Rourke came into the office. Good morning, Roark, Jake said. I want you to meet a good friend, Harry Rex Vonner. Harry Rex shook her hand and looked her up and down. He clearly thought she was very attractive.
Nice to meet you. What was your first name?
Call her Roark, Jake said. She'll clerk here until the Haley trial's finished.
That's nice,
said Harry Rex, still looking at Ellen, not at Jake. Harry Rex is a local lawyer, Roark, and one of the many you cannot trust.
What did you hire a female law clerk for, Jake?
He asked. Roark's brilliant in criminal law, like most third-year law students. And she's very cheap.
Do you have something against females, sir?
Ellen asked.
No, ma'am. I love females. I've married 4 of them.
She looked at his big, dirty shoes, the cheap socks that had dropped around his ankles, his dirty cotton trousers, his old dark blue jacket, his pink wool tie that fell a long way above his fat stomach, and she said to Jake,
I think he's sweet.
I might make you wife number 5,
Harry Rex said.
The attraction is purely physical,
she said. Careful, Jake said. There's been no sex in this office since Lucien left. How's the research?
There are dozens of insanity cases, and they're all very long. I've done about half. I plan to work on the others here.
Harry Rex moved toward the door.
Nice meeting you, Roark. I'll see you around.
"Thanks, Harry Rex," said Jake. "See you soon." 3 miles from Jake's office was a small, neat white country house where Ethel and Bud Twitty had lived for almost 40 years. It was a pleasant house, with pleasant memories of raising children who were now living in the North. The house was quieter now. Bud hadn't worked for years, not since his first illness in 1975, when he had had a heart attack, followed by 2 more. He knew that he would not live long, and he had accepted the fact. On Monday night, he sat on the front porch, listening to the football game on the radio. Ethel was working in the kitchen. Toward the end of the ball game, he heard a noise. He turned the sound down on the radio. Probably just a dog. Then another noise. He stood and looked toward the garden. Suddenly, an enormous figure in black with red, white, and black war paint across his face jumped onto the porch and pulled Bud to the ground. Bud's shout for help was not heard in the kitchen. Another man joined the first one, and they pulled the old man down the steps and into the garden. One held him, and the other hit him in the stomach and face. Within seconds, he was unconscious. Ethel heard noises and ran through the front door. She was caught by a third member of the gang, who twisted her arm violently behind her and put his hand over her mouth. She couldn't scream or talk or move, and was held there watching the 2 men beat her husband. On the sidewalk, 10 feet behind the violence, stood 3 figures, each wearing the white clan robes. They came out of the darkness and watched the beating. After an impossibly long, horrible minute, the beating slowed down.